On so-called Liberation Day, Trump threatened to whack a 34% tariff on all Chinese imports coming into the United States, to go on top of the 20% tariff he imposed a few weeks ago. This was already pretty insane, but when, in the spirit of reciprocity, China threatened to impose its own 34% tariff on all American imports coming into China, Trump responded by adding yet another 50%. There was some hope that this was a bluff, but on Wednesday morning, Trump went ahead and raised the flat tariff rate on Chinese imports to an astonishing 104%, which means that if you're an American trying to import something from China, you have to pay more in tariff fees than you're actually spending on that product. The CCP have insisted they won't back down, but it's clear that slapping tariffs on American imports isn't going to change Trump's mind. So, in this video, we thought we'd take a look at China's nuclear option in this escalating trade war between the world's two biggest economies, namely dumping all its American bonds, whether it could actually happen, and what this would mean for the global economy. Explore which world leaders are winning and which are losing every week with our new podcast, The World Leader Leaderboard. Find it over on the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or in your favourite podcast app. So to understand this story, you need a bit of context. As you probably already know, the US runs a massive bilateral trade deficit with China. In other words, the US imports a lot more Chinese stuff than China imports from the US. The US also reliably runs the biggest overall trade deficit in the world, i.e. it imports more than it exports overall, while China reliably runs the biggest overall trade surplus. In many ways, this is the defining feature of today's global trading system. China exports more stuff than it imports, and this surplus is essentially absorbed by the United States, in the form of American consumers buying tons of Chinese-made goods. So how does this keep happening? After all, trade deficits are usually temporary, because importing more than you export eventually puts downwards pressure on your currency, which ultimately forces your trade to balance. Just imagine if, say, Argentina imported more than it exported, as has often been the case. When Argentines import things, this essentially involves selling Argentinian pesos to buy foreign currencies, and then using those foreign currencies to import foreign goods. When foreign countries import from Argentina, they will essentially buy Argentinian pesos with their foreign currency, and then use those pesos to buy Argentinian goods. When Argentina is importing as much as it exports, pesos are being bought and sold in equal amounts, so the pesos' value should hold steady. But when Argentina is importing more than it's exporting, then more pesos are being sold than bought, which should push the value of the peso down, reducing Argentina's imports and increasing its exports until its trade account is balanced and the peso stabilizes again. So how does the US get away with running persistent deficits? Well, this is a hotly debated question in macroeconomics, but at least some of it has to do with how China recycles its dollars. When China exports stuff to the US, it gets lots of US dollars in return. Now, usually this would push up the value of China's currency, the yuan, via exactly the mechanism we just described, and ultimately balance China's trade account. But China likes having a devalued currency because it keeps its exports competitive. Devaluing your currency is way easier than overvaluing it. China just gets its central bank to effectively print more yuan and then use those to buy dollars on exchange markets, strengthening the dollar and therefore weakening the yuan. Nonetheless, this still leaves China with a massive pile of dollars, which China uses to buy US government debt in the form of treasuries. Today, China holds some $800 billion worth of treasuries, making them the largest foreign holder of US government debt after only Japan. While this is less than the $1.3 trillion or so China had in the early 2010s, this figure probably understates the true value of China's treasury holdings because, partly in reaction to pressure from Chinese nationalists who don't like the idea of China lending to the US, China has recently shifted its treasury holdings off its official books onto state-adjacent entities instead. China has also started buying other forms of US debt, like mortgage-backed securities from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which is sort of indirectly US government debt, because both agencies are backed by the federal government. So why is China lending the US government billions of dollars? Well, it's in part because treasuries are the world's reserve debt instrument. There are tons of them floating about, which means they're easy to sell, even in a crisis, and they pay a nice interest rate. But it's also because it strengthened the dollar and allowed the US government to spend more, essentially propping up American demand for Chinese goods, perpetuating America's trade deficit and making America more and more dependent on Chinese manufacturing. This has created a sort of mutual interdependence between America and China, sometimes nicknamed Chinmerica. China relies on America to buy its stuff, and America relies on China to fund its debt. In the current trade war, Trump is leveraging China's reliance on American consumers, which has raised the question, could China leverage America's reliance on Chinese lending? In other words, could China dump its treasuries and other American government debt? Well, there are reasons to be skeptical. For starters, selling dollar-denominated assets would cause an appreciation of the yuan, which would make it even harder for Chinese exporters to sell their stuff abroad, and it's not clear where else China could park their cash. But perhaps more importantly, China dumping its treasuries and other American bonds could cause a full-on market meltdown. China only accounts for a small fraction of the overall treasury market, and in normal times, it might push up American borrowing costs, but the US could probably handle it. However, as you might already know, the US is already almost in debt crisis territory. As we're writing this on Wednesday morning, treasuries are being sold off at record rates as investors flee America, which is pushing yields, i.e. the interest the US has to pay on its debt, up to recent highs. If China were to dump its treasuries in this context, it could be the straw to break the camel's back, and perhaps even push the US into full-blown default territory. This would be terrible for America, sure, but it would also be terrible for the entire global economy, China included. This is the reason China actually refused a Russian plot to dump their mortgage-backed securities and exacerbate America's economic crisis back in 2008. Nonetheless, if Trump continues his assault, the CCP might decide that, if there's going to have to be a global economic crisis, it might as well be on their terms. This story, like much of the news, is worth paying attention to in the weeks ahead, because with geopolitics in flux and Trump throwing the international order up in the air, there's a lot to keep an eye on. Every day, we're faced with weird headlines, from Musk declaring anyone who looks at him the wrong way a terrorist, to Trump declaring war on Jupiter to try and regain some extraterrestrial allies. Okay, that one wasn't real, but we do dive deep into the weird world of US politics in our series WTF USA. That's our show where we take big moments from culture and social media and try to explain the political implications of, say, Musk running around trying to put out Tesla fires. Unlike some of our other serious videos, the tone of WTF USA is more lighthearted and takes something of an irreverent look at what's going on. If you're interested, WTF USA can be found exclusively on Nebula. Nebula is also the home to other incredible original content from your favourite creators, like Real Life Law's series War Room. Given how much conflict and geopolitical disagreement there is right now, it's hard to stay on top of everything that's happening. So the show attempts to get you up to speed every month, explaining everything that you've missed and helping you feel more informed. If you didn't know, Nebula is an independent, creator-owned streaming platform that specializes in thoughtful content, from creators like Real Life Law, Wendover Productions, Legal Eagle, and Neo. It's not just WTF USA either. You can also watch every normal TLDR video on Nebula ad-free, and in some instances before they land on YouTube. If you're not a member already, click the link in the description to get 40% off. That's just $36 for a year or $3 a month. So take the news a little less seriously and check out WTF only on Nebula.